This story begins in the middle of the Pacific, on the small atoll of Midway. Midway is a 6.2 square kilometer atoll in the North Pacific, 2,113 northeast of Honolulu, and about halfway between the Japanese and American shores, hence the name Midway. Midway is an American possession since August 28, 1867, when Captain Reynolds of the USS Lackawanna officially took possession of the atoll for the United States. A military base was built on the two main islands of the atoll, called Sand Island and Eastern Island. That base included several airfields, barracks, the whole thing. In 1942, movie director John Ford was sent to Midway by the United States Navy. At first, Ford believed that he was expected to film everyday life of the soldiers on this tiny rock in the middle of nowhere. One day, June 4th, 1942, Ford was in transit on the atoll, resting in his bunk, when he hears alarm sounds, gunfire, engine sounds. Without hesitation, he rushes outside to see what is going on. What Ford saw was a sky filled with AA gun tracers and Japanese aircrafts. Ford grabs his 16mm handheld camera and starts filming what would become a turning point in the Pacific War. Hello there, I'm Sergeant Darth Raptor the Wise, and today I will tell you about the Battle of Midway, or how to win a war in 6 minutes. In the introduction, I spoke about the Japanese attacking Midway, but how did we got here? How did it came to this? Let's make a recap. 1942. World War II has been going on for 2.5 years, and even though the US has joined the war on the Allies' side after Pearl Harbor, the situation does not look good for the Allies on all fronts, especially in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan seized Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and prepares to invade Australia. The US Pacific Fleet was crippled after Pearl Harbor and only had two operational aircraft carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. Lexington was sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Wasp was undergoing repairs at Norfolk, and the Yorktown, badly damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea, managed to be towed to Pearl Harbor. It was estimated that it would take several months at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard to get her back into shape. However, not all news were bad. On April 18, 1942, the US Navy launched a daring raid against Japan, the famous Doolittle raid, which could be a good subject for another video. Anyway, the bombers launched by the carrier Hornet dropped their bombs on Tokyo, inflicting little damage but creating an important morale boost and giving a huge humiliation to the Empire of the Rising Sun. That attack started a long chain of events that would culminate in the Battle of Midway. Before the raid, because of strategic disagreements between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army, there was no follow-up strategy to Japan's lightning-quick conquest of the West Pacific. The main concern of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the raid on Pearl Harbor and commander of Japan's combined fleet, was the US carrier fleet. For most of the other high-ranking officers, it wasn't much of a threat. However, the Doolittle raid made them realize that not only their home islands were vulnerable, but the American aircraft carriers were still a huge threat. Yamamoto and his staff devised a plan, codename Operation MI. Similarly to all Japanese plans during the war, it was exceedingly complex and required perfect coordination and timing. The idea was to attack the Midway Atoll with a carrier fleet during the two lost US carriers out of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese believed that Yorktown had been sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea, and they knew about Wasp, so they were convinced that the US could only bring two carriers to the fight. By the time these carriers would reach Midway, the atoll would be in Japanese hands, another fleet containing battleships would be in the sector, and the American carriers would be destroyed during a daylight gun battle. Simultaneously, another Japanese fleet was to invade the Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, but we won't speak about that here. The plan was extremely bold, but it was flawed. The several Japanese fleets deployed were too far apart to mutually support each other. The attack on the Aleutian, supposed to happen simultaneously to the Midway attack, took place a day before because of a delay in the sailing of Nagumo's task force. Speaking of him, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the carrier fleet, was, to quote another Japanese admiral, Nishizo Tsukahara, an officer of the old school, a specialist of torpedo and surface maneuvers. He did not have any idea of the capability and potential of naval aviation. End quote. Japan also had its fair share of shortcomings. Carrier Division 5, consisting of Shokaku and Zuikaku, the two most advanced carriers of Kido Butai, Japan's carrier fleet, was in Kure for replacement of their air fleet and personnel. Many of the aircrafts being deployed in operation since November 1941 were worn out and more unreliable. Production of some of the carrier fleet's aircraft, such as the D-3A1 Val dive bomber, was drastically reduced, and for some, like the B-5N2 Kate torpedo bomber, completely stopped, meaning that there was no replacement for losses, and spare parts were in short supply. To add to that, Nagumo's carrier force was, to quote Mark Beatty, specialist in modern Japanese history, a glass jaw. It could throw a punch, but couldn't take one. The fleet's defensive organization was not extremely effective. Japanese AA guns and fire control systems weren't very effective because of design flaws and configuration deficiencies. The fleet's combat air patrols had too few fighters at its disposal. The fleet did not have an adequate early warning system, especially because of the lack of radar. There was poor communication capabilities with the CAP in flight, and the escorting warships were deployed too far from the carriers to use their anti-aircraft guns to protect these carriers. The Americans, on the other hand, had an ace up their sleeve, as they knew about the trap the Japanese wanted to lure them in, and decided to trap the Japanese themselves. The US cryptanalysts at Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, managed to partially crack code JN25B, the current Japanese Navy code. Since early 1942, the decoded messages were hinting at an attack on objective AF. After several brainstormings, the team acquired the certitude that the target was the Midway atoll. To gain confirmation that Midway was indeed the target, a ruse was devised by Captain Holmes. An uncoded message was sent stating that Midway's water purification system had broken down. Within a day, Hypo decoded a message saying that AF was short on water. The Americans were preparing for the battle with a clear picture of the enemy plan and tactical dispositions. The Japanese, on the other hand, were completely unaware of the American preparations, convinced they were the one deceiving the other. To add to that, Yorktown, whose repairs were estimated to be several months long, was repaired in 72 hours and battle ready. Repairs weren't extremely well done, it was just to allow the carrier to be deployed for a few days of operation. So, let's go over the order of battle. Maybe a little tedious, so feel free to skip. The Japanese deployed two fleets, one for Midway, the other for Dilution. We'll only go over the fleet assigned to Midway. Just to clear things up, only Nagumo's 1st Carrier Striking Force and Kurita's Midway Support Force were involved in the fighting, the American trap preventing the others to fulfill their original designated purpose. So, we have the 1st Fleet, made of the 1st Fleet main force, composed of the 1st Battleship Division under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, consisting of battleships Yamato, Mutsu, and Nagato. The Carrier Group, consisting of Hosho, equipped with 8 B-4Y1 Jean biplane torpedo bombers and destroyer Yukaze. The Special Force, light aircraft carriers Chiyoda and Nishin. The Screening Force, the 3rd Destroyer Squadron under Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto aboard Sendai, made up of the 11th Destroyer Division under Captain Kichiro Shoji, consisting of Fubuki, Shirayuki, Hatsuyuki, and Murakumo, and the 19th Destroyer Division under Captain Ranji Oi, consisting of Isonami, Uranami, Shikinami, and Ayanami, and the 1st Supply Group under Captain Shigeyasu Nishioka, consisting of Naruto and Toeimaru. Also part of the 1st Fleet, the 1st Carrier Striking Force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, composed of the 1st Carrier Division under Vice Admiral Nagumo himself, composed of Akagi, carrying 18 Zero fighters, 18 Val dive bombers, and 18 Kate torpedo bombers, and Kaga, carrying 18 Zero fighters, 18 Val dive bombers, and 27 Kate torpedo bombers. The 2nd Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, composed of Hiryu, carrying 18 Zero fighters, 18 Val dive bombers, and 18 Kate torpedo bombers, and Soryu, carrying 18 Zero fighters, 16 Val dive bombers, 18 Kate torpedo bombers, and 2 Judy dive bombers. The Support Group, 8th Cruiser Division under Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, consisting of Tone and Chikuma, each carrying 3 Jake float planes and 2 Dave float planes, and the second section of the 3rd Battleship Division under Rear Admiral Tamotsu Takama, consisting of Haruna and Kirishima, also carrying 3 Jakes in 2 days. The Straining Force, the 10th Destroyer Squadron under Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura aboard Nagara, made up of the 4th Destroyer Division under Captain Kosaku Aruga, consisting of Nowaki, Arashi, Hikikaze, and Maikaze. The 10th Destroyer Division under Captain Toshio Abe, consisting of Kazagumo, Yugumo, and Makigumo, and the 17th Destroyer Division under Captain Masayuki Kitamura, consisting of Urakaze, Izokaze, Tanikaze, and Hamakaze. And Supply Group 1 under Captain Masanao Ota, consisting of Destroyer Akigumo and supply ships Kyokuto Maru, Shinkoku Maru, Toho Maru, Nippon Maru, and Kokuyo Maru. Next we have the 2nd Fleet, the Midway Invasion Force, composed of the 2nd Fleet Main Body under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, composed of the 3rd Battleship Division, less its 2nd Section under Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, consisting of Kongo and Hiei, the 4th Cruiser Division, less 2nd Section under Vice Admiral Kondo, consisting of Atago and Chokai, the 5th Cruiser Division under Vice Admiral Takeo Takaki, consisting of Miyoko and Haguro, the Screening Force, the 4th Destroyer Squadron under Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura aboard Cruiser Yura, composed of the 3rd Destroyer Division under Captain Ranji Oe, consisting of Murasame, Samidare, Harusame, and Yudachi, and 9th Destroyer Division under Captain Yasuo Sato, consisting of Hasakumo, Minegumo, and Natsugumo. The Carrier Group under Captain Sueo Obayashi, consisting of Zuiho, carrying 12 Zero fighters and 12 Kate torpedo bombers, and Destroyer Mekazuki. The Supply Group under Captain Jiro Murao, consisting of Sata, Tsurumi, Genyomaru, Kenyomaru, and Akashi. Then we have the Midway Occupation Force under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, composed of the Transport Group under Captain Minoru Ota, carrying about 5,000 troops under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki of the Imperial Japanese Army, consisting of Sports Kiyosumi Maru, Keiyo Maru, Zenyo Maru, Goshu Maru, Toa Maru, Kano Maru, Argentina Maru, Hokuroku Maru, Brazil Maru, Kirishima Maru, Azuma Maru, Nankai Maru, patrol boats number 1, 2, and 34, and the Akebono Maru. The Escort Force under Rear Admiral Tanaka aboard light cruiser Jinsu, composed of the 15th Destroyer Division under Captain Torajiro Sato, consisting of Kuroshio and Oyashio, the 16th Destroyer Division under Captain Shiro Shibuya, consisting of Yukikaze, Amatsukaze, Tokitsukaze, and Hatsukaze, and the 18th Destroyer Division under Captain Yoshito Miyasaka, consisting of Shiranui, Kagero, Kazumi, and Arare. The Seaplane Tender Group under Admiral Ruitaro Fujita, composed of the 11th Seaplane Tender Division, consisting of Chitose, carrying 16 Roof float planes fighters and 4 Jake Scout float planes, and Kamikawa Maru, carrying 8 Roof and 4 Jakes, plus destroyer Hayashio and patrol boat number 35. Then there is the Midway Support Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, composed of the 7th Cruiser Division under Vice Admiral Kurita himself, consisting of Kumano, Suzuya, Mikuma, and Mogami. The 8th Destroyer Division under Commander Nobuki Ogawa, consisting of Asashio and Arashio, plus the oiler Nichei Maru. There's also the Minesweeper Group under Captain Sadatomo Miyamoto, composed of 4 auxiliary minesweepers, Tamamaru number 3 and 5, and Showa Maru number 7 and 8, 3 sub-chasers, CH-16, CH-17, and CH-18, supply ship Soya, and cargo ships Meiyo Maru and Yamafuku Maru. And finally, the last component of the Midway Force, the 6th Fleet, the Advanced Submarine Force, under Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu aboard cruiser Katori, composed of the 3rd Submarine Squadron, made of the 19th Submarine Division, under Captain Ryojiro Ono, consisting of I-156, I-157, I-158, and I-159, the 13th Submarine Division under Captain Takeji Miyazaki, consisting of I-121, I-122, I-123, and finally the 30th Submarine Division under Captain Masao Teraoka, consisting of I-162, I-165, and I-166. On the American side, we have the Carrier Strike Force, made of Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, composed of Task Group 17.5, the carrier group, consisting of USS Yorktown and her air group, along with elements of the USS Saratoga air group, VF-3 Fighter Squadron under Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, 25 Wildcats, VB-3 Dive Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, 18 Dauntless, VS-5 Dive Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Wallace C. Short Jr., 19 Dauntless, and VT-3 Torpedo Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Lance E. Massey, 13 Devastators. Task Group 17.2, the Cruiser Group under Rear Admiral William W. Smith, consisting of USS Astoria and USS Portland. And finally, Task Group 17.5.4, the Destroyer Screen under Captain Gilbert Hoover, consisting of Hammond, Anderson, Gwynn, Hughes, Morris, and Russell. Task Force 16 under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, composed of Task Group 16.5, the Carrier Group, consisting of USS Enterprise, her air group, VF-6 Fighter Squadron under Lieutenant James S. Gray, 27 Wildcats, VB-6 Dive Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Richard H. Best, 19 Dauntless, VS-6 Dive Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Wilmer E. Gallagher, 19 Dauntless, and VT-6 Torpedo Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Eugene E. Lindsay, 14 Devastators, and USS Hornet and her air group, VF-8 Fighter Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Samuel J. Mitchell, 27 Wildcats, VB-8 Dive Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Robert R. Johnson, 19 Dauntless, VS-8 Dive Bomber Squadron under Lieutenant Commander Walter F. Rhodey, 18 Dauntless, and VT-8 under Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, 15 Devastators. Task Group 16.2, the Cruiser Group under Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid, consisting of Pensacola, Northampton, New Orleans, Minneapolis, Vincennes, and Atlanta. Task Group 16.4, the Destroyer Screen under Captain Alexander R. Early, composed of Destroyer Squadron 1, consisting of Phelps, Warden, Monahan, and Aylwin, Destroyer Squadron 6, consisting of Balch, Cunningham, Benham, Ellett, and Maury, and the Oilers Group, consisting of Cimarron, Plata, and Destroyers Dewey and Monson. Then we have the Submarines Operational Command under Rear Admiral Robert H. English, composed of Task Group 7.1, the Midway Patrol Group, consisting of Cachalot, Flying Fish, Tambor, Trout, Grayling, Nautilus, Grouper, Dolphin, Gato, Cuttlefish, Gudgeon, and Grenadier, and Task Group 7.2, consisting of Narwhal, Plunger, and Trigger. Then there's the Midway Garrison, composed of Marine Aircraft Group 22 under Colonel Ira L. Kimes, consisting of VMF 221 Marine Fighter Squadron, 21 Buffaloes and 7 Wildcats, and VMSB 241 Marine Attack Squadron, 19 Dauntless and 17 Vindicators. Navy Air Units under Captain Cyril T. Simard, 31 Catalinas from Patrol Wings 1 and 2, 6 Avengers from VT-8 Torpedo Bomber Squadron from USS Hornet, and detachments from the 7th Air Force under Major General Willis Hale, 4 Marauders from 18th Reconnaissance and 69th Bombardment Squadrons, and 17 Flying Fortresses from 26th, 31st, 72nd, and 431st Bombardment Squadrons. As for the local defenses on Midway under Colonel Harold D. Shannon, we have C&D companies, 2nd Raider Battalion, USMC, the 6th Defense Battalion, USMC, and the 1st Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron, consisting of 11 PT boats. And finally, we can mention the Midway Refueling Unit under Commander Harry R. Thurber, composed of oiler USS Guadalupe and destroyers USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot. In total, the numbers being a bit uncertain, we have, for the Japanese, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers, 248 carrier-based aircrafts, 16 float planes, and 13 submarines, plus the 4 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 12 float planes of the Midway Support Force, not to mention the 2 light carriers, 5 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and approximately 35 support ships that did not participate in the battle. For the Americans, we have 3 fleet carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 15 destroyers, 16 submarines, 233 carrier-based aircrafts, and 127 land-based aircrafts. Again, if you make the calculations. I'm not sure the numbers add up, but history is an exact science. So we have two fleets around Midway, both convinced they are setting up a trap to the other. The board is set. The pawns are moving. June 3rd, 1942, 0900. A PBY Catalina hydroplane from VP-44, piloted by Ensign Jack Reid, patrolling the Midway perimeter looking for the Japanese fleet, spots the Japanese occupation force 930 km west-southwest of Midway. That fleet is thought by the Americans to be the Japanese main fleet and is reported as such. At 12:30, 9B-17 took off from Midway for the first attack, the opening shot of the Battle of Midway. They reached Tanaka's transport group 3 hours later, 1,060 km to the west. Anti-aircraft fire is heavy, the bombers drop their payloads, but fail to hit anything. The hostilities commence. Tomorrow will be a long day. June 4th, 1942, the fateful day. Around 0100, Japanese oiler Akebono Maru is hit by a torpedo launched by Catalina. This would prove to be the only successful air-launched torpedo attack by the US during the battle. 0430. The dice are rolled. No turning back now. Nagumo launches the initial air attack against Midway. 36 VALs, 36 Kates, and 36 Zeros for escort. 7 search aircrafts are also launched, but the assigned search area is way too large for so few planes to cover, not helped by poor weather conditions northeast and east of the Japanese fleet. At the same time, 11 Catalinas leave from Midway to continue their search. 0534. One Catalina reports the sighting of 2 enemy carriers. 10 minutes later, another Catalina spots the first airstrike wave from the Japanese. That same wave is detected by Midway's radar several kilometers away. All interceptors are scrambled, even the escort fighters supposed to protect the bombers sent against the Japanese fleet, and are redirected against the enemy air wave. 0620. The Japanese aircrafts reach and bomb Midway. John Ford, whom I talked about in the intro, rushed to film this attack and was wounded during the battle. The damage dealt to the base was heavy, but the American Marine fighters and anti-aircraft defenses are not going down without a fight. Casualties were heavy on both sides. On the first assault, 2 Wildcats and 13 Buffaloes are shot down, and most planes on the island are damaged. Only 2 remaining airworthy. As for the Japanese, 11 of their aircrafts were destroyed. Among those 11, 3 were ditched. 14 more aircrafts were heavily damaged, and 29 others were lightly damaged. This first wave isn't very successful. The airbase on Midway is still usable by planes for landing, refueling, and re-attacking. Midway's land-based defenses remained mostly intact. The returning Japanese pilots reported to Nagumo that another wave against Midway would be necessary if troops wanted to land on Midway by June 7th, which was the schedule of the Japanese invasion according to their original plan. Just before the attack on Midway, the rest of the bombers based there took off to attack the Japanese carrier fleet. The first American planes to reach the enemy fleet consisted of 6 Avengers transferred from VT-8 of Hornet's Air Wing, with 11 Vindicators, 16 Dauntless, 4 Marauders equipped with torpedoes, and 15 Flying Fortresses. These initial attacks were easily repelled by the Japanese, losing only 3 of their own Zeros, while destroying 5 Avengers, 2 Vindicators, 8 Dauntless, and 2 Marauders, without suffering any major damage. As a side note, among the brave pilots killed was Major Lofton R. Henderson of VMSB 241, who found death while leading his inexperienced Dauntless squadron into battle. As a tribute, the main airfield on Guadalcanal would be named after him. There was some close calls, though, for Nagumo during this first wave. One Marauder, piloted by Lieutenant James Muir, who just dropped his torpedo, was flying away, searching for a safe escape route. So it flew down the length of Nagumo's flagship, carrier Akagi, the interceptor fighters and AA guns having to hold their fire to avoid collateral damage to the flagship. As the Marauder was pod racing over Akagi, the plane strafed the ship, killing 2 sailors. A little later, another Marauder, heavily damaged, did not pull out of his attack run, heading directly for Akagi's bridge. It is unknown if it was a deliberate suicide ramming attempt, if his controls weren't responding, or if the pilot was wounded or even dead. Nevertheless, the plane very closely missed crashing into the carrier's bridge, which would have killed Nagumo and his staff, and finally cartwheeled into the sea. It is believed that this event convinced Nagumo to launch another attack on Midway, thus equipping the reserve planes for ground assault, which was a direct violation of Yamamoto's order to keep the reserve force for anti-ship operations. While all of that is going on in the air, below the sea, USS Nautilus, an American submarine commanded by Lieutenant Commander Brockman, approaches the enemy fleet and attracts unwanted attention from the escorts. At about 0820, Nautilus makes an unsuccessful torpedo attack against the battleship and is forced to dive to protect herself. At 0910, she tries again, this time against a cruiser, missing again and diving again. But this time, the Japanese destroyer Arashi is sent in pursuit and spends a long time chasing Nautilus. It has its importance, you'll see. The orders for Operation MI were quite clear. Nagumo was to keep half of his planes in reserve. That amounted to 2 squadrons of dive bombers and torpedo bombers. The torpedo bombers were already equipped with torpedoes in anticipation of an attack if an enemy fleet was detected in the perimeter. As for the dive bombers, they weren't armed yet. It was a doctrine in the Japanese Navy to arm these planes on the flight deck, right before takeoff. At 0715, because of the attack from the aircraft sent from Midway and the flight leader's recommendation when he returned from the first wave, which I already mentioned, Nagumo ordered the reserve planes to be rearmed with contact-fused general-purpose bombs used against land targets to hit Midway again. While the rearming was underway, 30 minutes after the order was given, the scout plane from Tone reports an American naval force to the east, but doesn't describe its composition. Evidence found later suggests that Nagumo only received the report at 0800. Realizing this, he reversed his order to rearm the planes for ground assault and asked the scout planes to describe the composition of the enemy fleet. After 20 to 40 minutes, the scout plane radios Tone to report the presence of one enemy carrier in the American force. This was one of the carriers from Task Force 16. The other one avoided detection somehow. The Japanese were now facing a grave dilemma. Some, like Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2, recommends Nagumo to attack immediately with all available planes, 16 valves on Soryu, 18 valves on Hiryu, and half of the ready cover patrol fighters. But the Japanese's window to hit the Americans was closing fast. Indeed, the strike force sent to attack Midway was about to return, and needed to land rapidly or would be forced to ditch into the sea. The intense combat air patrol activities of the last hour and the associated flight deck activity prevented the Japanese from preparing the reserve planes on the deck to launch. At the time the attack came, the only Japanese aircrafts on deck were defensive fighters, or fighters of the combat air patrols being spotted, which is the official term for positioning an aircraft on the flight deck for launch. Spotting and launching anything would require 30 minutes minimum, and by doing this, Nagumo would have sent his reserves without dedicated anti-ship weapons and likely without escort, and he just witnessed the consequences of such reckless action by watching the first American bombers getting absolutely murdered. The Japanese doctrine about the use of aircraft carriers was that sending fully constituted strikes was more effective than launching disorganized squadrons. Nagumo's reaction, without confirmation that the enemy fleet included carriers, that intel only came at 0820, could be qualified as doctrinaire. At 0753, the arrival of another American strike sent from Midway convinced Nagumo to hit the island again, but he decided to wait for the first strike force to land and then launch the reserves, by then properly armed with torpedoes. While the Japanese ponder on what they should do, the American carriers began to launch their aircrafts at 0700, Enterprise and Hornet completing launching at 0755, while Yorktown, who started a little later, finished at 0908. Early in the morning, the American commanders already knew of the presence of the Japanese, thanks to the PBY sightings. Fletcher, commanding Yorktown, ordered Spruance to attack the Japanese as soon as it was practical for his squadrons, holding Yorktown in reserve if any other Japanese carriers were found. Spruance judged that an attack could be successful despite the extreme distance between the two fleets, and gave the order to proceed. Captain Miles Browning, Chief of Staff aboard Enterprise, worked out the details and oversaw the launch. For the planes to launch into the wind, the light southeasterly breeze required the carriers to sail away from the Japanese full speed. Browning fixed the launch time at 0700, leaving 1 hour to the carriers to close on the Japanese at 25 knots, that's 46 kilometers per hour, That would put them 287 kilometers from the Japanese fleet, assuming that it would hold its current course. The first plane took off from Spruance's carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, after 0700, while Fletcher, after completing its own scouting patrols, launched at 0800 from Yorktown. Fletcher and Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding Yorktown, had gained experience firsthand in organizing and launching strikes against an enemy fleet in the Coral Sea, but these lessons couldn't be passed to Enterprise and Hornet. Nevertheless, Spruance ordered the squadrons to proceed to the target immediately without wasting time to assemble in a large strike force. Why? Because the key to the survival of the American task force was the destruction of the enemy carriers as fast as possible. The Japanese managed to launch 108 aircraft in 7 minutes. Meanwhile, Enterprise and Hornet launched 117 planes in 1 hour. Spruance's plan was simple. He needed to throw something at the Japanese as soon as possible. The American squadrons were launched in several different groups, completely disorganized. This lack of coordination was accepted, and the higher casualties that induced were deemed worthwhile, because keeping the Japanese occupied with several bomber waves coming would prevent them from launching a counterstrike, and Spruance gambled that they'd find Nagumo's flight decks at their most vulnerable. Despite a position that was given, the American carriers had trouble finding the targets. Hornet's strike followed an incorrect heading, 265 degrees instead of 240 degrees, indicated by contact report. Because of this, the air group's dive bombers missed the enemy carriers. VT-8 broke formation and followed the correct heading, while the 10 Wildcats supposed to escort them ran out of fuel and ditched. VT-8 found the enemy fleet and made its run at 0920. Then VF-6 from Enterprise reached the fleet at 0940, but fell back because the Wildcats were too low on fuel, leaving the 15 Devastators alone. Unescorted, the torpedo bombers were shot down one after the other. I should add here that the torpedo bombers were the planes that were the most likely to be shot down during World War II. Why? Because for a successful torpedo attack, the bomber must fly low and slow to drop its torpedo with maximum accuracy, making it a super easy target for enemy fighters and AA guns. Plus, the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was unable to defend itself against enemy fighters, being way too lightly armed. So when 15 low-flying, slow targets show up, the Japanese defenses light them up, and it's a carnage. All Devastators were shot down without any damaging any Japanese ships. Of the 30 men from VT-8, only Ensign George H. Gray Jr. survived after getting shot down following his torpedo attack, who missed its target, Carrier Sorio. At about the same time, VT-6 made its run, and resulted in carnage once again, losing 9 out of 14 Devastators during the run, and ditching one later. At 10:10, VT-3 from Yorktown attempted the run once again, only ending up losing 10 of their 12 Devastators. Of all these planes launched at the Japanese, none scored a single hit on the Japanese ship. Some Devastator torpedoes may have hit their targets, but I have to mention the extremely unreliable yet extremely common at that time Mark 13 torpedo, the standard issue in the American Navy. And at that time, it didn't get the much needed improvement that it would get later down the line. Because of this weapon, the few Devastators that crossed the Hellfire Japanese AA and defense fighters had managed to get close enough to drop their torpedoes, perhaps even strafe the enemy ships a little and forcing them to take evasive action. But their torpedoes would either miss entirely, hit the target and fail to detonate, or detonate too early, or even sometimes going deeper than intended and go under the target. During the battle, half a dozen torpedoes were released so close to the target that with any other torpedo, the enemy ship would have been very heavily damaged. But because they used Mark 13 torpedoes, yet unimproved, their attacks produced no results. In total, at Midway, 35 out of 41 torpedo bombers engaged had been destroyed without hitting anything. As I said, the Mark 13 would be improved later during the war, and the Battle of Midway would be the last time the TBD Devastator would be flown into battle. But at the beginning of the Pacific War, these issues were quite common with these torpedoes. However, to say that the attacks conducted by the torpedo bombers were just a pointless carnage could not be farther from the truth. True, it was a carnage for the torpedo bomber squadrons, but it allowed the American victory at Midway. Let me explain. Because of these unrelenting attacks by three different squadrons, the Japanese carriers had to be kept maneuvering to avoid torpedo hits, leaving them unable to launch any counterstrike. Because the torpedo bombers needed to fly low to drop their torpedoes, the Japanese fighters needed to fly low to shoot them down, thus losing precious altitude. Also, after the long pursuit of American torpedo bombers, the Japanese Zeros started to run out of ammo and fuel. Finally, and more importantly, the arrival of VT-3 turned the Japanese defenses and CAP to the southeast quadrant to shoot them down. We'll see soon enough why this has importance. At the same time VT-3 threw itself into the jaws of death, three squadrons of Dauntless from Enterprise in Yorktown were closing in on the enemy fleet from southwest and northeast. VB-3 from Yorktown followed VT-3, which I already mentioned, but decided to follow a different course for their attack. It was by luck that the two squadrons from Enterprise, VB-6 and VS-6, reached the Japanese fleet. They were running low on fuel, having spent a long time looking for the enemy, and the squad leader ordered to continue searching for a bit, when he spotted, out of nowhere, in the vast, featureless immensity of the Pacific, the wake of a ship. This ship turned out to be Japanese destroyer Arashi, rejoining the fleet after a long, unsuccessful hunt for the Nautilus. The bombers followed the direction taken by Arashi and reached the fleet. According to Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet and the architect of the American plan, the choice of the squad leader, a man named Wade McCluskey, quote, decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. End quote. The three American dive bomber squadrons each arrived at a different direction, speed, and altitude, even though all of them were perfect for a run on the Japanese carriers. As stated, because of VT-3, Japanese defenses were out of position, pointing the wrong way for the AA guns and flying too low to intercept in time for the fighters. To add to that, Japanese bombers' rearmament was still ongoing, with ammunition and fuel hoses lying everywhere, because the refueling and rearming was being executed very hastily. Because of Nagumo's indecision about which type of ordnance to equip, bombs and torpedoes were lying everywhere, turning the carriers into potential bombs. At this point, there is nothing the Japanese can do to stop what is about to come. If the American torpedo bombers weren't extremely effective, it was completely different with the dive bombers. The American pilots were very good at dive bombing and were flying the exceptional SBD Dauntless, was so successful it saw active service from 1940 to 1944 and flying more than 1 million operational hours, just counting the US Navy and Marine Corps. The Americans also had another advantage, handed them on a plate by the Japanese. The Japanese painted at the bow of their carriers on the flight deck what they call Hinomaru, which is the big red circle on their flag, supposed to represent the rising sun. Well, it turned out that for dive bombers, these giant red circles are ideal aiming spots. Given that the dive bomber descends on his target at about a 90-degree angle, these red circles would have filled the crosshairs of the American pilots. At 10:22, VB6 and VS6 divide in two groups. One will hit Akagi, the flagship, and the other Kaga. They start dividing and realize they were both diving on Kaga. So when he realizes this, Lieutenant Richard Best, a very talented pilot, and his two wingmen break off, exit their dives, and turn their attentions towards Akagi. As for Kaga, under attack by two American squadrons, she falls under a rain of bombs. She is hit between 3 and 5 times, all direct hits setting her ablaze. A bomb also landed near the bridge, or directly on it, counts the verge, but what is sure is that the bridge is wrecked, and the ship's captain and his staff are killed. A few minutes later, Best and his two wingmen dive on Akagi. Only the bomb dropped by Best is a direct hit. It is not confirmed that it's his bomb that hit, but it was most certainly him. That bomb is extremely well dropped. It hit the edge of the midship deck elevator, pierces through the upper hangar deck, and detonates in the middle of the aircraft being rearmed and refueled, causing a gigantic explosion and a huge fire. The hangar quickly became a blazing inferno, and fire control teams were unable to put it out. Almost simultaneously, VB-3 started its run against Soryu. At least 3 bombs hit their targets, and they caused heavy damage once again creating a large fire ignited by gasoline. And it's just a chain reaction. The fire detonates a few bombs placed here, causing the explosion of torpedoes placed there, and it keeps going and going. In 6 minutes, Kaga and Soryu were engulfed in flames from bow to stern, Akagi took a little longer to burn, but fire quickly became impossible to put out, and Nagumo had to reluctantly agree to abandon his flagship, transferring it to light cruiser Nagara. In 6 minutes, the Americans have destroyed 3 enemy carriers. Well, not destroyed yet, but so damaged that they could not be repaired. It was hoped that Akagi could be towed to Japan, but it was, along with the 3 other carriers, abandoned and scuttled. Also, the Nautilus returned unnoticed and took a shot at Kaga, launching 3 torpedoes, only scoring 1 hit, who was a dud. When he understood and processed what just happened, Nagumo was in a state of shock. He was not prepared to this eventuality. He was seen standing near the ship's compass, looking at the burning carriers, including the one he was in a trance-like daze. When he was asked to abandon Akagi, he muttered, "It's not time yet." He was convinced to live by his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryonosuke Kusaka, but he agreed reluctantly with tears in his eyes. At 10:46, Admiral Nagumo transferred flag from Akagi to Nagara. The carriers did not sink immediately, no damage was dealt under the waterline, but they had to be scuttled. The Japanese were hit hard, but not knocked out yet. The last of their carriers, Hiryu, did not waste any time. His first attack wave, 18 valves and 6 zeros for escort, directly followed the American bombers returning to their carriers after their run. In an attempt to get revenge for their 3 carriers, they attacked the first American carrier they met, USS Yorktown, at 12:05. 3 bombs hit, blowing a hole in the deck, rendered almost all boilers out of order, and destroyed an AA platform. Admiral Fletcher had to move his command staff to heavy cruiser Astoria. However, unlike the Japanese carriers, the repair crews patched the flight deck temporarily and restored several boilers, so Yorktown can now travel at 35 km per hour and is still combat capable. After the attack, Yorktown was still capable of launching air operations. As a symbol of inspiration, Captain Buckmaster ordered that a yellow flag hold atop of Yorktown, meaning breakdown, was replaced by a huge American flag, 3 meters wide and 4 meters long. During the first Japanese counterattack wave, 13 dive bombers and 3 fighters were destroyed. Also, 2 escorting Japanese fighters break off early to pursue a few Dauntless from Enterprise returning to the carriers, and were damaged by the dive bombers they were hunting. Hiryu's second attack wave reaches the American fleet at 14:30. 10 Kates, escorted by 6 Zeros, headed for Yorktown, who had been fixed so well that the Japanese air crews thought they had found another carrier. They managed to hit her with 2 torpedoes at the cost of 5 torpedo bombers and 2 fighters. After the hit, Yorktown lost all power and started listing 25 degrees to port. When the 2 Japanese waves returned, Japanese morale rose up. Each wave reported the sinking of an enemy aircraft carrier. The losses were high, that's true, but the Japanese believed they could gather a number of aircrafts large enough to launch a final wave against the only American carrier they believed was left. Before the second wave from Hiryu attacked Yorktown, one of the planes sent by the damaged American carrier spots Hiryu at 13:30. Immediately, the remaining American bombers take off to deliver the definitive killing blow. A total of 24 Dauntless take off, 6 from VS-6 and 4 from VB-6 from Enterprise, and 14 from VB-3 from Yorktown. Even though Hiryu was fiercely defended by a dozen of Zeros, the attack run is successful. 4, possibly 5 bombs hit and cripple Hiryu, rendering it unable to operate aircrafts. One of the bombs, dropped by Dusty Clyce from Enterprise, hit Hiryu on the bow. Remember, that's where the Hinomaru was painted. That hit was so effective it rendered the carrier unusable. A little while later, a few bombers from Hornet reached the fleet. Their launch was delayed because of communications problem. They went for rescue ships but didn't hit any. Like the 3 other carriers, fire control teams aboard Hiryu tried but proved unable to control the burning, forcing Hiryu to be evacuated. The rest of the fleet sailing northwest, hoping to intercept the American carriers. A destroyer moved into position to scuttle the burning giant with torpedoes, releasing the volley and quickly fleeing, but the ship stayed afloat for a few more hours. Next morning, one of the scout planes from escort carrier Hosho spotted the abandoned but still floating wreck. Soon after the spotting, Hiryu sank once and for all, taking with Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, one of the best carrier officer of the IJN, and the ship's captain Tomeo Kaku, who both chose to stay aboard the ship. It is said that one young sailor asked to stay on board, but his request was denied. Going back to the 4th. While the night fell, both Nagumo and Fletcher made plans to continue the battle during the night. Well, I say Fletcher, but he ceded operational command to Spruance because he felt he could not properly command from cruiser Astoria. Spruance was decided to protect both Midway and his carriers. During the day, to help his bombers, who were launching at extreme range, his fleet closed in on the Japanese one. After a report from submarine USS Tambor, who detected Yamamoto's fleet, Spruance decided to withdraw his carriers to the east, and at midnight they changed course again, heading once more towards the enemy. As for Yamamoto, he decided to continue to pursue the Americans with his large fleet, while sending a small cruiser force to bombard Midway. Because of the Americans' temporary withdrawal to the east, the Japanese failed to find them, and Yamamoto had to order a general withdrawal to the west. On June 5th, the last Japanese carriers sank. Soryu sank the 4th at 1610, Kaga at 1925. On June 5th, Akagi sinks at 0500, and the last of them, Hiryu, disappears below the waves at 0900. All day long, Spruance launches aircraft to find Yamamoto's fleet, but they fail to find it. At the end of the day, all bombers were sent on a search and destroy mission against any enemy ship they'd find, but it proved useless as they didn't sight any of Yamamoto's ship. The lost aircraft returned to their carriers by nightfall, forcing Enterprise and Hornet to turn on all their lights to help them land. It was 02:15 on the morning of the 5th when USS Tambor, commanded by Commander John Murphy, positioned 170 km west of Midway, spotted several ships through his periscope. Murphy and his executive officer, Edward Spruance, not to be confused with Raymond Spruance, in charge of the carrier fleet, failed to identify the ships and did not want to come any closer to check their type. So they sent a message to Admiral Robert English, commander of the submarine force of the Pacific Fleet, who passed it to Nimitz, commander-in-chief of said fleet, who then passed it to Spruance, the commander of the carrier fleet, and Spruance was furious. The message was extremely vague, speaking about, quote, 4 large ships. It did not provide any concrete information whatsoever about the mysterious ships. As Yamamoto's fleet main body had not been found yet, Spruance had no choice but to conclude these ships were the main invasion force and moved to block it, staying 190 km northeast of Midway. The ships spotted by the Tambor weren't the invasion force, but they were the small force Yamamoto sent to bombard Midway, consisting of 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers. The 7th Cruiser Division and the 8th Destroyer Division from Kurita's Midway Support Force. At 02:55, the small group was ordered by Yamamoto to change course and fall back. While that order came in, Tambor was sighted and the cruiser initiated dodging maneuvers to avoid being hit by torpedoes. During these maneuvers, heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma collided. Of the two, Mogami was the most damaged, suffering heavy damage to the bow. Mikuma was forced to slow down to 22 km per hour to keep pace with the damaged Mogami. At 0412, the sky was bright enough to allow Murphy to formally identify the mysterious ships, and he immediately dived to launch a torpedo attack. This attack failed, and he only reported the 2 westbound heavy cruisers at 0600. I must mention that both ships were following a straight course and were moving rather slow, making them ideal targets for a submarine attack. As for the Tambor, as soon as he returned to base, Spruance had Murphy relieved of duty and reassigned to a shore station because of his vague message and poor performance. During the next 2 days, attacks were sent against the 2 fleeing cruisers from both Midway and the carriers. Mikuma was destroyed by dive bombers, while surprisingly the very damaged Mogami endured even more damage but made it to port safely. Bombers also attacked and strafed destroyer Arashio and Asashio that were still in the area. While all of that is happening, the Americans hadn't gave up on Yorktown yet. It had been badly damaged by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes, but was still afloat, and salvage efforts were encouraging. The ship was towed by USS Vireo, a small fleet tug. On the afternoon of June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through the American defenses and fired a salvo of torpedoes at the damaged ship and her escort destroyer. Two of them hit Yorktown, causing few casualties, the ship being mostly evacuated, but one torpedo hit the destroyer USS Hammond, who was providing auxiliary power to Yorktown. The destroyer broke in two and sank quickly. Most of the sailors aboard were killed by the explosion of her own depth charges. 80 sailors went down with Hammond. After the attack, the repair crews were evacuated from Yorktown as any more repairs were deemed hopeless. By June 7th, in the early morning, Yorktown started to lean more and more heavily on port side, eventually revealing the torpedo holes. All shipmasters half-masted their colors in salute. Two Catalinas flying by waved their wings, also in salute. And at 0701, USS Yorktown rolled upside down and sank slowly, stern first, the huge American flag raised on the mast by Captain Buckmaster still flying. The Battle of Midway was over. Spruance withdrew his carriers, as a pursuit near Wake had become too dangerous, and his fleet sailed east to rendezvous with carrier Saratoga, who was carrying much-needed replacement aircrafts. Fletcher turned Saratoga into his flagship, and they kept sending search missions to be sure that Midway was safe for the time being. On June 10th, American carriers were withdrawn and returned to Pearl Harbor. On the same day, the Imperial Japanese Navy, at a military liaison conference, didn't report the full extent of the disaster. In his report, which was only submitted to the highest-ranking members of the military June 15th, Nagumo explained the situation. However, he made the comment that he didn't think the Americans were aware of their plans, which was false as they cracked the Japanese codes. The public and most of the military in Japan was kept in the dark about this terrible defeat. Only the superior officers in the Navy and the Emperor himself knew the toll of the battle. It was so well hidden that even the Imperial Japanese Army didn't know about the true state of the Navy for a little while, at least. When the Japanese fleet returned to Hashirajima on June 14th, the wounded were interned on naval hospitals, kept as secret patients, and were isolated from the others and their own families. For the men still in combat shape, they were reassigned to the South Pacific very fast, and most of them died in battle. The officers that were responsible for this disaster, including Nagumo, were all kept at their post. Nagumo was even allowed to keep command of the remains of the Japanese carrier force. As for the Japanese carriers, they improved damage control techniques and adopted numerous safety procedures with limited efficiency. I even heard that, to replace their losses, the Japanese asked Germany if they could get the only German aircraft carrier still unfinished, the Graf Zeppelin, whose story deserves an episode on its own. I can't find any proof of that, though. I'll just put it there. If you have any, please let me know. The Battle of Midway costed the Japanese a lot of experienced pilots, so to be able to replace them quickly, training for new pilots was abbreviated, leading to a decline in Japanese pilots' quality. The Battle of Midway changed the course of the Pacific War. It stopped the Japanese expansion in their tracks and allowed the Americans to gain the strategic initiative. The Japanese still tried some offensive, but after the disaster of Guadalcanal, they switched to defensive for the rest of the war. The Japanese defeat thwarted their plans to invade Australia and continue to expand southward. That battle weakened the Japanese Navy, costing them irreplaceable pilots, technicians, and very expensive and hard-to-build aircraft carriers. The Americans and their huge industrial power allowed them to replace material losses way faster than Japan ever could. That battle led to the victory in the Pacific for the Allies. In his book, The Art of War, Sun Tzu said that hostile armies may face each other for years, striving to achieve victory that is decided in a single day. In the case of the Pacific War, June 4th, 1942 was that day. Losses were heavy on both sides. The Americans lost one carrier, one destroyer, about 150 aircrafts, and 307 men. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircrafts, 3,057 men, and 37 captured men. This video is dedicated to the brave men of both sides who fought and died in this battle. Today, the memory of this battle still lives on. On the atoll of Midway, a memorial was built. 2 American aircraft carriers would be named USS Midway in honor of this important victory. If you want, the images taken by John Ford during the battles were turned into a propaganda movie called The Battle of Midway, which you can still watch today. There's also been a movie released recently called Midway, starring Woody Harrelson as Admiral Nimitz, telling this incredible story. The film was quite good, actually. You can also listen to the song from Sabaton, Midway, and you can play Battlefield 1942. The graphics are a little old, but they're the Midway map. That is it for today. Thanks for listening, and may the force be with you.